The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Clarence's house as 10-year-old Prince George wandered through the corridors that had become his temporary home. His father, Prince William, was away on royal duties, and his mother, Catherine, was attending a charity event that would keep her busy until late evening. The house felt unusually quiet, with only the soft footsteps of staff members echoing through the marble hallways. George had always been a curious child, much like his great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, had been at his age. Today, that curiosity led him down a wing of the house he rarely visited. The staff quarters and private rooms of his step-grandmother, Queen Camilla, were located here. As he walked past the ornate doors, one stood slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of an elegantly furnished bedroom. The young prince paused, knowing he shouldn't enter without permission, but something caught his eye. A shaft of afternoon sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating a beautiful antique dresser. The mahogany wood gleamed, and several jewelry boxes sat atop its polished surface. George had always been fascinated by the stories behind the royal jewelry collection, especially the pieces that belonged to his beloved grandmother, Princess Diana. His mother had told him countless stories about Diana, painting vivid pictures of a woman who was not only beautiful but also kind, compassionate, and deeply loved by people around the world. Catherine had made sure that George understood his grandmother's legacy, even though Diana had died long before he was born. These stories had created a deep connection between the boy and the grandmother he would never meet. As George stood in the doorway, he remembered his mother's words from just the previous week. They had been looking through old photo albums together, and Catherine had pointed to a picture of Diana wearing a stunning sapphire ring. "Your grandmother's engagement ring is very special, George," she had said, her voice soft with emotion. "It represents love, hope, and the promise of a beautiful future. One day, when you're older, you'll understand why such things matter so much." The memory of that conversation made George's heart race as he stepped closer to the dresser. He told himself he would only look, not touch anything. The jewelry boxes were beautiful in themselves, each one crafted from different materials and representing different eras of royal history. Some were simple and elegant, while others were ornate and decorated with precious metals. George's attention was drawn to a particular box made of deep blue velvet. Something about its color reminded him of the sapphire in his grandmother's ring from the photographs. His small hands trembled slightly as he approached it, his conscience battling with his curiosity. He knew the rules about private property and respecting others' belongings, but the pull was too strong. The young prince glanced around the room, listening carefully for any sounds that might indicate someone was approaching. The house remained quiet except for the rain and the distant sound of staff members going about their duties in other parts of the building. Taking a deep breath, George carefully lifted the lid of the blue velvet box. Inside, nestled on a bed of white silk, lay the most beautiful ring he had ever seen. The large oval sapphire caught the light and seemed to glow with an inner fire, surrounded by a cluster of brilliant diamonds that sparkled like stars. George's breath caught in his throat as recognition dawned on him. This was the ring from the photographs, the one his mother had shown him just days before. This was Princess Diana's engagement ring. George stared at the ring, his young mind struggling to process what he was seeing. He had learned in his history lessons that this ring should have been with his mother, Catherine. It was tradition, his tutors had explained, for such precious family heirlooms to be passed down through the direct line of succession. When his father had proposed to his mother, he had given her this very ring as a symbol of his love and their future together. So why was it here, in Queen Camilla's jewelry box, instead of on his mother's finger where it belonged? The young prince carefully picked up the ring, feeling its weight in his small palm. It was heavier than he had expected, and he could see tiny inscriptions inside the band that he couldn't quite read in the dim light. As he held it, George felt a strange connection to the grandmother he had never met but had heard so much about. This ring had once symbolized her love story with his grandfather, Prince Charles, now King Charles III. But that love story had not ended the way fairy tales were supposed to end. George knew the basic facts, though his parents had been careful to present them in age-appropriate ways. His grandfather and grandmother had divorced when his father was young, and, later, Diana had died in a car accident in Paris. It was a tragedy that had shaken the entire royal family and the world. What George didn't fully understand yet were the complex emotions and relationships that had led to that divorce. He didn't know about the years of pain, the feeling of betrayal, or the other woman who had been part of the story from the beginning. He only knew that his grandmother had been sad, and that made him sad too. As he held the ring, George began to understand something that made his stomach feel tight and uncomfortable. If this ring was supposed to be his mother's, and it was here instead, then someone had taken it away from her. Someone had decided that Catherine, the woman who had married his father and become the Princess of Wales, didn't deserve to wear Diana's ring. The realization hit the 10-year-old like a physical blow. Queen Camilla, the woman he had been taught to respect as his step-grandmother, had taken something that belonged to his mother. But why would she do such a thing? And, more importantly, why hadn't his parents told him about it? George sat down on the edge of a nearby chair, still holding the ring carefully in his hands. He thought about all the times he had seen his mother's hands, looking for jewelry, looking for this ring specifically. Catherine wore her wedding band, of course, and occasionally other pieces for special events, but he had never seen her wear this sapphire ring. Now he knew why. The young prince tried to remember if he had ever heard his parents arguing about jewelry or family heirlooms. Prince William and Catherine were generally careful not to argue in front of their children, but sometimes George caught snippets of serious conversations when they thought he wasn't listening. Had there been discussions about this ring that he had missed or forgotten? As he sat there, surrounded by the quiet luxury of Clarence House, George felt a profound sense of injustice beginning to form in his chest. His mother was kind, beautiful, and loved by everyone who met her. She worked hard for her charities, took excellent care of her children, and supported his father in all his royal duties. She deserved to wear his grandmother's ring. She deserved to carry on Diana's legacy in that tangible, beautiful way. But, instead, the ring was hidden away in Queen Camilla's private collection, as if it were just another piece of jewelry rather than a symbol of love, loss, and family history. George looked around the room, taking in the other jewelry boxes and the obvious wealth displayed there. Queen Camilla had plenty of beautiful jewelry of her own. She had pieces that had been given to her by his grandfather, pieces that had belonged to other royal family members, and pieces she had inherited from her own family. Why did she need this one too? Why did she need the one piece that should have connected his mother to the grandmother he would never meet? The injustice of it all made tears prick at the corners of George's eyes. He was old enough to understand fairness, old enough to know when something was wrong, but still young enough to feel overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't fully name. He felt angry, sad, and confused all at the same time. Carefully, George placed the ring back in its velvet box, but he didn't close the lid immediately. He stared at it for a long moment, memorizing every detail. The way the sapphire seemed to change color depending on the angle of the light. The intricate setting of the diamonds. The delicate engravings on the band. He wanted to remember everything so he could describe it to his mother later. Because George had already decided, with the clear moral certainty that only children possess, that his mother needed to know about this. She needed to know that her ring, the ring that should have been hers by right, was being kept from her. She needed to know that the symbol of her connection to Diana was just a few rooms away, hidden in someone else's jewelry box like a guilty secret. As he finally closed the velvet box and prepared to leave the room, George felt a weight settling on his young shoulders. He had stumbled upon a family secret, and now he had to decide what to do with that knowledge. Part of him wanted to march straight to his parents and demand an explanation. Another part of him wondered if he should keep this discovery to himself, afraid of causing trouble or making things worse. But the strongest part of him, the part that had inherited both Diana's compassion and William's sense of justice, knew that secrets like this one were meant to be brought into the light. His mother deserved better than this, and his grandmother's memory deserved better too. The young prince quietly left Queen Camilla's room, closing the door softly behind him. As he walked back through the corridors of Clarence House, his mind raced with plans and possibilities. He would wait for the right moment, when his parents were both home and relaxed. Then, he would tell them what he had found, and together they would figure out how to make things right. George didn't yet understand all the complexities of royal protocol, family politics, or the delicate balance of relationships within the monarchy. He didn't know about the years of careful diplomacy that had gone into blending the family after his grandfather's remarriage. He simply knew right from wrong, and this felt very, very wrong. As he reached his own room, George sat down at his desk and pulled out a piece of paper. In his careful handwriting, he wrote down everything he could remember about the ring, its appearance, its location, and, most importantly, how seeing it had made him feel. He folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his schoolbook, where he would be sure to find it later. That night, as George lay in his bed listening to the rain still pattering against his windows, he thought about his grandmother Diana. He imagined what she might have been like, what stories she might have told him, what games they might have played together. He pictured her wearing the sapphire ring, and he could almost see her smile as she reached out to ruffle his hair the way his mother did. Diana had been known for fighting for what was right, even when it was difficult or unpopular. She had championed causes that others ignored, spoken up for people who couldn't speak for themselves, and always tried to make the world a better place. George felt certain that if Diana were still alive, she would want her ring to be worn by the woman who had married her son, who was raising her grandchildren, and who was working to continue her legacy of service and compassion. As sleep finally began to claim him, Prince George made a promise to himself and to the grandmother he had never met. He would find a way to make sure his mother got the ring that should have been hers all along. He didn't know exactly how he would do it, but he was determined to find a way. The next morning would bring new challenges and difficult conversations, but tonight, George felt the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing you've discovered an important truth. The rain continued to fall outside, washing the world clean and preparing it for whatever was to come. In Queen Camilla's room, the blue velvet jewelry box sat quietly on the mahogany dresser, holding its precious secret. But secrets, George was beginning to learn, have a way of making themselves known when the time is right. And, for Princess Diana's sapphire ring, that time was finally approaching. 3 days had passed since George's discovery, and the weight of his secret felt heavier with each passing hour. He found himself watching his mother more closely, studying her hands during breakfast, noticing the simple wedding band that seemed somehow incomplete without its famous companion. Catherine moved through her daily routines with her usual grace and warmth, completely unaware that her son was carrying knowledge that could change everything. The young prince had tried several times to find the right moment to approach his parents, but something always seemed to interrupt. Royal schedules were demanding and unpredictable, with last-minute changes and urgent matters constantly requiring attention. When his father was home, there were briefings with advisors, phone calls with government officials, or preparation for upcoming engagements. When his mother was free, his father was often away, leaving Catherine to manage 3 children and her own royal duties. George had learned patience from watching his parents navigate these challenges, but now that patience was being tested in ways he had never experienced before. Every meal shared with Queen Camilla felt like an exercise in self-control. He found himself studying her carefully manicured hands, looking for signs of the ring he knew was hidden just upstairs. But Camilla wore her own elegant jewelry, pieces that suited her style and status, never giving any hint of the treasure she was keeping locked away. On Thursday morning, George finally sought his opportunity. His younger siblings, Charlotte and Louis, had gone to a playdate with friends from their school, and both his parents were home for a rare quiet breakfast together. The family sat in the sunny morning room at Kensington Palace, where they lived most of the time, sharing scrambled eggs and fresh fruit while discussing the day's plans. "Mummy," George said, trying to keep his voice casual as he buttered his toast, "do you ever miss wearing Grandmother Diana's ring?" The question hung in the air like a sudden chill. Catherine's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips, and Prince William's newspaper rustled as his grip tightened on the pages. George immediately sensed that he had touched on something significant, something that carried emotional weight far beyond what he had expected. Catherine carefully set down her cup and looked at her eldest son with a mixture of surprise and concern. "What made you think about that, darling?" she asked gently, her voice carrying the careful tone she used when approaching sensitive subjects. George felt his cheeks grow warm, but he forced himself to continue. "I was just wondering. In the pictures you showed me, it looked so beautiful on her. And you said it was special because it represented love and hope." He paused, gathering courage. "I thought maybe you would want to wear it too, since you married Papa." Prince William folded his newspaper completely and set it aside, giving his full attention to the conversation. George could see something complicated flickering across his father's face at pain, perhaps, or maybe just the careful consideration that came with navigating family matters that involved the royal hierarchy. "George," William said slowly, "that ring is indeed very special. It was your grandmother's engagement ring, and it holds many memories." He exchanged a meaningful glance with Catherine before continuing. "But things like royal jewelry are sometimes more complicated than they might seem. There are traditions and protocols that govern how such pieces are handled." The explanation felt incomplete to George, who had inherited his mother's ability to read between the lines of what adults said versus what they meant. "But traditions say that engagement rings should go to the son's wife, don't they?" he pressed, remembering lessons about inheritance and family customs. "In my history books, it says that's how these things usually work in royal families." Catherine reached across the table and took her son's hand. "You're very thoughtful to wonder about these things, George. And you're right about traditions. But, sometimes. She paused, clearly choosing her words carefully. Sometimes there are other considerations that affect how decisions are made. What kind of considerations? George asked, his young mind struggling to understand why anyone would override such a clear and obvious tradition. William and Catherine exchanged another look, and George could sense an entire conversation happening in that silent moment between his parents. They were clearly trying to decide how much to tell him, how to explain adult complexities to a 10-year-old mind that saw the world in terms of right and wrong. When your grandfather married Queen Camilla, William finally said, there were many adjustments that the family had to make. Some were easy, and some were more difficult. The matter of your grandmother Diana's personal jewelry was one of those difficult adjustments. George felt a flicker of hope. Maybe his parents didn't know where the ring was. Maybe if he told them about his discovery, they could simply ask for it back. But, where is the ring now? He asked, trying to sound innocent. Do you know where it went? The silence that followed was profound and telling. Catherine's hand tightened slightly around George's, and William's jaw tightened in a way that the young prince had learned to recognize as a sign of suppressed frustration or anger. The ring is safe, Catherine said finally, her voice steady but somehow hollow. It's being kept with other pieces from your grandmother's collection. But why can't you wear it? George persisted, sensing that he was getting closer to the heart of the matter. If it's safe and you know where it is, why can't you have it? You're Papa's wife now. You're the Princess of Wales, just like Grandmother Diana was. The comparison seemed to hit Catherine like a physical blow. She had always been conscious of following in Diana's footsteps, of living up to the legacy of a woman who was beloved around the world. The pressure was immense, and George's innocent question highlighted the painful irony of her situation. It's not that simple, darling, she said softly. There are feelings involved, and history, and, well, sometimes the right thing to do isn't always the obvious thing. But George's sense of justice was too strong to be satisfied with such vague explanations. Whose feelings? He asked directly. If the ring should be yours, then who has feelings that are more important than doing what's right? William ran his hand through his hair, a gesture George recognized as a sign that his father was feeling stressed or conflicted. George, you have to understand that Queen Camilla has been part of our family for many years now. She's been kind to you children, and she's worked hard to support your grandfather in his role as king. Sometimes, keeping peace in the family means making compromises about things that might not seem fair on the surface. The explanation felt like a betrayal to George's young sense of morality. He was being asked to accept that kindness and hard work somehow justified keeping something that didn't belong to you. It was like saying that if someone was nice to you, you should let them keep the toy they had taken from your toy box. But, compromise should work both ways, shouldn't it? George asked, surprising his parents with the sophistication of his reasoning. If Queen Camilla wanted to keep peace in the family, wouldn't giving Mummy the ring be a good way to do that too? Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes. Her son's logic was flawless and heartbreaking at the same time. He was right, of course. In a perfect world, in a family governed purely by fairness and tradition, the ring should have been hers from the day she married William. But the royal family was not a perfect world, and it was not governed purely by fairness. Sometimes, George, she said carefully, when people have been hurt in the past, they hold on to things that make them feel secure or important. The ring might represent something different to Queen Camilla than it does to us. George frowned, trying to understand what his mother meant. What could it represent to her? It wasn't her engagement ring. She didn't love grandfather first. She came after Grandmother Diana, didn't she? The blunt truth of the statement hung in the air like an accusation. George didn't yet understand the full complexity of his grandfather's first marriage, but he grasped the basic timeline well enough to understand that Camilla had not been Charles's first choice for a wife. William felt a familiar stab of pain at the mention of his mother's place in the timeline. Diana had indeed been first to marry his father, first to bear his children, first to capture the public's heart. But she had not been first in Charles's affections, a fact that had contributed to the breakdown of their marriage and, ultimately to the tragedy that had claimed her life. Adult relationships are complicated, son, William said finally. Your grandmother Diana was very special, and she was deeply loved. But the story of what happened in our family before you were born involves many people's feelings and many difficult situations. George sensed that his father was trying to protect him from painful truths, but his curiosity and sense of justice were stronger than his parents' desire to shield him. "I know that grandmother Diana died in a car accident," he said quietly. "And I know that she and grandfather were divorced before that happened. But I don't understand why that means Queen Camilla gets to keep her ring." The directness of the question forced William and Catherine to confront the reality they had been trying to avoid. Their son was old enough to ask difficult questions, and he deserved answers that respected his intelligence while still being appropriate for his age. Catherine took a deep breath and made a decision. "George, the truth is that there were disagreements about your grandmother's jewelry after she died. Some people felt that her personal pieces should stay with certain parts of the family, while others felt they should be distributed differently." "What did you and Papa want?" George asked. "We felt," William said carefully, "that the engagement ring should follow tradition and come to your mother when we married. But we were overruled by people who had different ideas about what was appropriate." George felt his anger flare at the idea of his parents being overruled about something so obviously theirs by right. "Who overruled you?" he demanded. "Who had the power to do that?" Again, his parents exchanged glances. They were approaching territory that involved criticizing senior members of the royal family, something that had to be handled with extreme delicacy. "The decision was made by people who were senior to us in the family hierarchy," Catherine said finally. "People who felt they knew what was best for everyone involved." "But they were wrong," George said with absolute certainty. "If traditions say the ring should be yours, then they were wrong to overrule tradition." William felt a surge of pride in his son's moral clarity, even as he worried about the implications of such clear-sighted judgment. "You're right that tradition would normally give the ring to your mother," he agreed. "But sometimes, George, being right and being able to act on being right are two different things." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of one of William's private secretaries, who apologized for the intrusion but explained that there was an urgent matter requiring the prince's immediate attention. As William excused himself, George was left alone with his mother for the first time since making his discovery. Catherine studied her son's face, seeing the frustration and confusion there. She recognized something of herself in his expression, the same desire for justice, the same intolerance for unfairness that had driven her own charitable work and her commitment to using her platform for positive change. "Mummy," George said quietly, "I need to tell you something important." Something in his tone made Catherine give him her complete attention. "What is it, darling?" George took a deep breath, knowing that once he spoke, there would be no going back. "I know where grandmother Diana's ring is." Catherine felt her heart stop for a moment. "What do you mean, George?" "I found it," he said simply. "I was at Clarence's house on Monday, and I saw it in Queen Camilla's jewelry box. The sapphire ring from the pictures you showed me. It's there, in her bedroom." The revelation hit Catherine like a physical blow. She had suspected, of course. There had been hints and rumors over the years, carefully worded comments from staff members who had seen more than they were supposed to see. But having confirmation, especially from her own son, made the reality undeniably real. "You're certain it was the same ring?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. George nodded solemnly. "It looked exactly like the pictures. The big blue sapphire with diamonds around it. And it was in a special blue box, like it was being kept safe and hidden." Catherine felt a mixture of emotions flooding through her: anger, sadness, vindication, and a deep sense of loss for something she had never actually possessed. The ring represented more than just jewelry, it represented connection to Diana, acknowledgement of her place in the family, and respect for the traditions that gave the monarchy its meaning. "What are you going to do, Mummy?" George asked, watching his mother's face carefully. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, processing not just the information but also the fact that her 10-year-old son had stumbled upon one of the family's most closely guarded secrets. Finally, she looked at George with an expression that combined pride, love, and determination. "I'm going to think very carefully about what the right thing to do is," she said. "And then, George, I think it's time for some very important conversations to happen in this family." The days following George's revelation were filled with quiet tension that seemed to permeate every corner of Kensington Palace. Catherine moved through her daily routines with the same grace and efficiency as always, but those closest to her could sense the change. Her smile seemed forced during public appearances, and she was unusually quiet during family dinners. William noticed the shift immediately, recognizing the signs of his wife wrestling with a decision that could have far-reaching consequences for their family. George, meanwhile, felt the weight of being keeper of such a significant secret. He had expected his mother to take immediate action after their conversation, perhaps marching straight to Clarence's house to demand what was rightfully hers. Instead, he watched as Catherine seemed to retreat inward, spending long hours in her study with the door closed, making phone calls that ended abruptly when the children approached. The young prince began to understand that adult problems were far more complicated than his 10-year-old mind had initially grasped. It wasn't simply a matter of right and wrong, fair and unfair. There were layers of history, protocol, and family dynamics that he was only beginning to comprehend. On Saturday morning, Catherine made a decision that would change everything. She asked her personal assistant to arrange a private meeting with Queen Camilla, requesting that it take place away from the formal settings of royal residences where conversations might be overheard or interrupted by staff. Instead, she suggested they meet at Highgrove House, King Charles's private residence in Gloucestershire, where they could speak freely without the pressure of official protocol. The request surprised Camilla, who was accustomed to more formal communications from William and Catherine. Over the years since her marriage to Charles, she had worked hard to build a respectful, if not particularly warm, relationship with her stepson and his wife. They had found a way to coexist peacefully at family gatherings and royal events, maintaining the appearance of unity that was so important for the monarchy's public image. But this request felt different. There was something in Catherine's tone, even through the formal language of the message, that suggested this was not going to be a routine family conversation. Catherine drove herself to Highgrove on Sunday afternoon, leaving the children with William, who understood the gravity of what his wife was about to do. They had spent hours the night before discussing strategy, weighing the potential consequences of different approaches. William wanted to accompany her, to present a united front, but they ultimately decided that this conversation needed to happen between the two women who had been most affected by the situation. Highgrove House sat peacefully in the Gloucestershire countryside, its garden showing the first signs of autumn color. Charles was away on a state visit to Australia, which Catherine had known when she requested the meeting. Some conversations were better held without the complicating presence of the person who connected all the parties involved. Camilla received Catherine in the morning room, a comfortable space filled with books and family photographs. She had arranged for tea to be served, and the setting felt more like a visit between friends than a formal royal meeting. But Catherine could see the wariness in the older woman's eyes, the careful way she moved and spoke that suggested she sensed this visit had a purpose beyond social courtesy. "Catherine, how lovely to see you," Camilla said warmly, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "You sounded rather urgent in your message. I hope everything is well with the children." "The children are fine, thank you," Catherine replied, accepting the offered seat but declining the tea. She had decided during the drive that there was no point in prolonging the social pleasantries. "Actually, it's something George said that prompted me to request this meeting." Camilla's expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. "Oh? What did George have to say?" Catherine took a breath, knowing that her next words would irrevocably change the dynamic between them. "He told me that he discovered Diana's engagement ring in your jewelry box at Clarence's house." The silence that followed was profound and loaded with years of unspoken tension. Camilla's teacup rattled slightly as she set it down, and Catherine could see the older woman's mind racing as she processed the implications of the statement. "I see," Camilla said finally, her voice carefully controlled. "And what exactly did you tell George about that?" "I told him the truth," Catherine replied steadily. "That sometimes family situations are complicated, and that decisions about important family items aren't always made based on tradition or fairness." Camilla's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or might have been fear. "Catherine, I think you're overstepping some boundaries here. That ring, and the decisions about it, were made by people with much more experience in these matters than you have. By people who felt that keeping a 19-year-old's choice of engagement ring was more important than honoring the memory of the woman who actually wore it," Catherine replied, her voice remaining calm despite the emotion underlying her words. "By people who decided that protocol mattered more than healing the wounds that have been festering in this family for decades." Camilla stood up abruptly, moving to the window that looked out over the gardens Charles had lovingly cultivated over the years. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she said, her back to Catherine. "You weren't there during the difficult years. You don't understand the complexity of what Diana's death did to this family, or the delicate balance that had to be maintained to move forward." "You're right," Catherine acknowledged. "I wasn't there.
But I'm here now, and I'm raising Diana's grandchildren.
And one of those children just discovered something that has shaken his understanding of fairness and family loyalty. Camilla turned back to face Catherine, her expression now showing more emotion than Catherine had ever seen from the usually composed woman. That ring represents more than just Diana's engagement, Catherine. It represents a time when this family was torn apart by jealousy, media attention, and competing loyalties. When Charles gave it to me to safeguard, he was trying to prevent it from becoming another source of division. Safeguard, Catherine repeated, tasting the word. Is that what you call keeping something that belongs to someone else? Because from where I sit, it looks more like claiming a trophy. The accusation hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Camilla's face flushed with anger, and, for a moment, Catherine saw beneath the carefully constructed facade of the queen consort to the woman who had spent decades fighting for her place in a family that had initially rejected her. How dare you, Camilla said, her voice low and dangerous. I have spent 20 years trying to earn my place in this family, trying to support Charles, trying to respect Diana's memory while also building my own role. That ring was never meant to be a trophy. It was meant to be protected. Protected from whom? Catherine asked. From William? From me? From the very people who had the greatest right to it? Camilla moved back to her chair, sitting down heavily as if the weight of the conversation was physically exhausting her. You want the truth, Catherine? The whole, ugly truth about why that ring isn't sitting in your jewelry box right now? Catherine nodded, sensing that they were finally approaching the heart of the matter. When Diana died, Camilla began, her voice quiet but steady, the entire royal family was in chaos. Charles was devastated, not just by the loss of life but by the guilt he felt over the way their marriage had ended. The public was angry, looking for someone to blame. The media was in a feeding frenzy. And, in the middle of all that, there were very real questions about what would happen to Diana's personal effects. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Diana's will left her personal jewelry to her sons, to be held in trust until they married. But, the engagement ring was different. It hadn't been Diana's originally, it had come from the royal collection, chosen by Charles when he was barely out of his teens and under enormous pressure to marry someone suitable. Catherine felt a chill of understanding beginning to form. So legally, it never actually belonged to Diana at all. Exactly, Camilla confirmed. It was a loan, in effect. A piece from the royal collection that was given to Diana to wear as long as she was married to the heir to the throne. When the marriage ended, technically speaking, the ring should have been returned to the collection. But it wasn't, Catherine said. Diana kept wearing it, even after the divorce. Camilla nodded. Charles didn't have the heart to ask for it back. Diana had made it famous, had worn it through all the significant moments of her public life. Taking it away from her would have seemed cruel, especially when she was already feeling rejected and isolated by the family. Catherine began to see the complexity of the situation in a new light. So when she died, what happened? The ring was returned to Charles, along with other pieces from the royal collection that Diana had kept. There was enormous pressure from all sides about what to do with it. Diana's family wanted her personal jewelry to go to her sons immediately. The palace wanted everything handled quietly and, according to established protocol. And, Charles. Camilla's voice softened. Charles was drowning in grief and guilt and couldn't make any decisions at all. So you made the decision for him, Catherine said, understanding dawning. Someone had to, Camilla replied defensively. The ring was becoming a symbol of everything painful about that time. Every time Charles looked at it, he saw his failures as a husband and father. Every time the press wrote about it, they used it as another weapon to attack the family. I suggested that it be put away safely until the